Welcome to the Very Occasional Podcast with Morgan Quaid. I'm joined today by Mark Anthony Powers, author of the Phineas Man series. So first of all, Mark, thank you for joining us on the Very Occasional Podcast.
Well, thank you for having me.
Now, the book series that you've written has a strong medical leaning. Would that be correct in saying that?
Absolutely. The main character is a pulmonary and critical care specialist.
Right. So my first question is, did you just out of the blue think medical crime drama stuff, that's what I'm going to do, and then just do a ton of research? Or has this come from your background, a medical background of some sort?
This comes from my background. That was my specialty.
Right. Okay. So that literally write what you know this. So you've written it. So I suppose the obvious question is, where did the idea come from? When was it? After a certain point in your career, you thought, you know what, this would make a great story, or how did that sort of evolve?
I retired from medicine, and as I got close to retirement, I started thinking about all the things that I'd seen over my career, medical and in life, and just started writing a story, and imagining a Phineas Man character in the 1970s when I started my career, and he's training, he's learning to become a doctor, he's dealing with his first patient dying under his care. The AIDS epidemic comes on soon afterwards, and he's immersed in the middle of that as his specialty demands. And then I thrust him into a disaster where he has to make decisions, life and death decisions under those conditions. And,
right.
his decisions come back to haunt him afterwards. So right. I wrote that story. That was my first book, and wasn't satisfied with it. Workshopped it some, still wasn't satisfied, put it in a drawer. And then I wrote the second book, which is Phineas Man in the 1990s. And that book, it takes place over a month. The first book I wrote took place over a decade, but the second one, Swarm in May, takes place over a month. And that one was inspired by some of the issues with systemic racism that we have in the United States and of course elsewhere in the world. And it's Phineas Man learning about systemic racism from a Black intern that he's supposed to be teaching.
Right.
And it happens that the son of one of their sickest patients is a racist without any hesitation about expressing his views, and he threatens the intern, and he threatens Phineas, and it just explodes from there.
Right.
So that was my debut novel, because after I finished it, I was quite satisfied with it, and I took it to my editor, and she helped me with that, and then said, "Okay, let's publish this." And so we did.
Right.
And then, meanwhile, I'm going back to the first one, and still working on it, and cut 50 pages out of it, improved some things. And while I was doing that, I was writing the third novel, which is Phineas Man in 2024. And I started writing it before the 2020 election in the United States. And I wrote it as though the outcome of the presidential election were different. And set it at the end of a second term. And meanwhile, climate change is getting worse, political polarization is getting worse, and Phineas is thrust in the middle of all that against his will, as he is developing himself a medical affliction, and it is impairing his skills, and he's having to deal with that. So that's my third one. That's called Nature's Bite. And then the fourth one is still a work in progress, although I've written the first few drafts of it, and that's further along as Phineas Man's affliction has worsened to a very late stage, and he's still being called on to use his medical skills, and not his skills so much as his medical knowledge and his keen eye to solve problems that other physicians are having challenges with, including people very close to him. So that's the series, and it spans 50 plus years, and it starts out with a fresh learner in medicine and ends with a person at the end of their life or reaching the end of their life. And
right. So the obviously the first book, you did eventually go back to that and publish that.
We published, that was my second one I published. And
right.
Then the third one published just a few months later because it was on a fast track as I was doing the second one.
Right. Which is, I've got to say, that for a writing journey, that's not a bad way to go, because usually your first novel is not going to be great, you know, because you're doing everything for the first time, and you know, so it's a good idea. Get that one out of the way and just shelve it for a while, move on to the second one, and then you can use everything you've learned, and then, well, this is actually really good, and then go back to the first and fix it up. That's not a bad way to do it, but you know, you need the patience, I suppose, and the self-awareness to sort of like, you know, not just, I need to get it out there quickly and you know, rush ahead.
I rewrote that at least 20 times. You know,
right.
But it was the backstory to everything else, and
yeah,
I just had to get it trimmed down to what was important for the first story.
Yeah, and I suppose that's important for a trilogy or 4 or 5 books, is if the first book is setting the scene, but you don't want it to read like a history. It still has to have a story within that first book. Yeah, but it's doing a lot of heavy lifting for the series. Yeah. The other thing I really like, so the 2 things I think most books need that to be compelling is internal conflict and external conflict. And just hearing the synopsis of some of these stories, you've got a great setup for both the external and the 2024 setup with the political situation and all that. There's your external conflict and then the racism with the other, you know, you've got all that set up, and having a condition yourself as a physician, it's a great way to have an internal conflict that develops and keeps things interesting, and it progresses. And so from a writing perspective, genius, sir, genius. Very, very, very clever way to do it.
Thank you. I hope my readers feel the same way.
And it gives you that nice sort of ticking clock aspect to keep things moving.
The last book takes place over 3 weeks when people are getting sicker rapidly, and there's definitely a ticking clock in that one.
Right. And actually, that's a good way of doing it, because so with each book, the amount of narrated time is shorter and shorter, by the sounds of it.
The second and third ones both were the second one, Swarm in May, took place over a month.
Right.
And then the third one, Nature's Bite, took place over 4 months.
Right. Okay.
Coming up from the spring to the fall of 2024.
So not quite. I was hoping for a nice clean strategy there, but not quite. I just invented that, but that's okay. So obviously you've drawn from a lot of your own experience with these the stories. How did the story just sort of present itself as you started thinking this was an interesting thing I encountered in my own life, or you know, how did you come up with the central story as opposed to the background and all of the nuance that your career sort of brings to the writing?
Well, the first book, there were experiences in my own life that led to some of the story. Training in the late 70s and being there when the first cases of what was called AIDS back then were happening, and we didn't know what it was. That's part of that story. In fact, some of the people that wrote the endorsements for me were some of the original AIDS researchers who were taking care of these people, and I was taking care of them too, and not knowing what the heck we were dealing with. It's like, the COVID pandemic happened and people were getting sick and nobody knew what was going on. So you've lived through that back in the early 80s when people were showing up with infections related to AIDS and nobody knew why. And we were taking care of them. It was just same kind of thing, but it was drawn out over years rather than a matter of weeks or months as the COVID pandemic broke. So that was how I wrote the first one. And but I wanted to put Phineas Mann in a real tight place. And so I put him in a disaster where he was having to make life and death decisions. And because the first one is about life and death and how does a physician deal with it. Nowadays we have palliative care teams and hospice that help the clinician with his patients when they reach that stage of their life. But in the 70s and 80s, we did it ourselves. We had chaplains and we had other people who could help us, but most of those end of the life decisions were on us. So I put those on Phineas Mann and turned up the temperature by putting him in the middle of a disaster, and then after the disaster, having people come back saying, "Wait, what did you do during that disaster?"
Which is a nice twist, nice aspect
his
of it.
Career and his family and everything else. So so that was the first one. Second one, Swarm and Meg just about wrote itself. Once I started thinking of a story arc where the team was trying to take care of a sick man, and the son was threatening them, and that just it was easy to escalate to a climax that, of course, Phineas Mann had to solve.
And what do you find in the writing process? What's the thing you struggle most with? Is it the getting started? Is it the midway point? Is it I've finishing a novel, the novel is now finished, now I need to edit? What's the point that you sort of struggle with the most, if at all?
I think writing a story is a lot of fun. I mean, that's not uncomfortable at all. And I once I have an overall arc, then it's just a matter of filling in the pieces on the arc. And so I write what's called a skeletal draft, and that might be 40,000 words. And then I go back and I read it, and I realize it could use this here and this here and this here, which is kind of putting meat on the bones, and then vital organs here and there, and it builds out from there until I get to what I think is a real novel. And that part for me is fun. It's just a matter of building something. And hard part is revising and editing, because an author, I don't think, sees things that need to be changed as well as somebody from the outside a lot of times. And so you've got to be willing to see what they're seeing, and you've got to have a thick skin and be willing to change things that you've written. I can't remember who it was that said you got to be willing to kill your darlings or murder your darlings, and so you got to be. That's a hard thing to do. So the workshopping and then the editing, the final editing, that's hard. Once we get through that, though, having it go to getting published, that's exciting. When and watch and having it come out and be able to hold it in your hand and say, "Yep, here it is," and that's really exciting. But then the hard part after that is promoting it.
And that's a whole different ball game.
It is, and thank you for helping me with that. So.
It's that's the one that I don't know any authors that don't struggle with that, either if they're successful at it but they still hate it, or they're struggling to get the word out and everything. It's a completely different beast. So writing a story with a lot of technical detail potentially that could come into it, and a lot of your experience that you bring to it. How did you go about that fine line between giving the book authenticity by having those details that readers wouldn't know, but lends credibility, and not losing? So not going to the CSI route where you're just explaining everything, so it doesn't, there's nothing to do, but also not making it so complex that people are kind of on the outside thinking,
No, that's a really good question. I will say that I think that all the medical stories that I've told are medically accurate. I've because a lot of my readers are medical people.
Yeah.
One of my first book clubs was a group of pulmonologists that read it, and so it had to be valid. The whole thing had to be valid.
Yeah.
My nobody in my novelist group is a doctor, and I'm in a group of 6 novelists, and we read each other's work every 2 weeks, and we critique. And when I first started in that group, they would say, hold your horses. That's too medical for us. And so I've gradually learned from them over the last almost 5 years to bring it to a point, I think, where a non-medical reader can enjoy it. I don't try to do the things on television where you make something up that's just unreal, because it's easier for the viewer or the reader. But I think I've got it to the point now when I portray a medical scene that the non-medical reader will hopefully enjoy it as much as a medical reader. But it's been a learning process.
Yeah.
When you come out of just doing medicine and everything you've written has been medical for so long, and then trying to make it fiction for every reader, it's a challenge.
Yeah. I can understand. Yeah, it's and it's one of those things that unless someone external tells you, you just don't know. You don't know what to pitch and what not to pitch and what level. And but it is great having a background to call on to inform your writing. That it just gives you this vast reservoir of. One of the reasons why I've shied away from certain types of novels is the sheer volume of research I would need to do, because I'm not an expert in that area, and I just think I don't want to spend 2 years researching this thing just so I can, have that information. That's why I tend toward fantasy, because no one can tell me that magical who's it, what's it isn't real. I made it up. It's definitely real. Anyway, so the I was going to ask. It's a pretty standard, bland question, but someone comes to you and says, "I want to write a novel." What would your advice be to that person?
My first advice would be to take some writing classes. My second advice might be to start journaling, just as practice. And if a notion comes to them for a good story, to write that down and take notes. I keep a notebook with me a lot of times, because I'll see something, I'll hear something. I like to cycle, I like to hike, and a lot of times in that quiet time where there's nothing else stimulating you, you'll get some ideas. On an average 2-hour bicycle ride, sometimes I would write 3 things down, and so I think keeping something with you it can be your cell phone, just writing down notes on that, certainly. But I think learning the craft of writing, I'm not going to say I've learned it. I'm certainly better at it than I was 5 years ago. But I think that's first thing. Second thing is to have other people that you can share with. You can see their writing, they can see your writing. You can get honesty. Have a thick skin. Don't take issue with criticism. Embrace it, because it can only make you better. What was the question again?
You've answered it comprehensively, sir. It was what advice would you give to new writers? Okay. And the interesting thing there that I've not heard yet is the journaling approach, which that's a great idea, because you're the habit of doing this sort of thing and learning how you write and how you voice what's in there on the page and all that sort of stuff. That's really, really valuable. That's a really good idea. Yeah.
I was very lucky when I started, because it was right after I retired and I had some free time, and I just set aside 2 or 3 hours a day to just sit down with my laptop and just say, okay, I'm going to try to write something today. And eventually it became a regular thing, and it came out more easily. And, some days I'd write 300-400 words. And that's you get a real high from doing that. When you're done, you sit down and you read what you've written and you go, wow, I'm a big gardener, and I tell people it's like going out and harvesting a bunch of vegetables out of your garden, and you've got this wonderful harvest out of what you've done. So yeah, it was a great feeling. And if you do that every day for a while, you've got a book.
Yeah. Yeah. That's true. And it's funny how many people have that. The initial blocker is just getting past that. It's I don't know if it's a perfection thing or a fear thing, but it's I can't get past the blank page, and I just can't get started because I need to have it all in my head before I start. Whereas the best advice is just start. Just start writing. The more you do, the better you get. It's not a thing. Just because you can write doesn't mean you can write a novel. So you need to practice and learn. But because we can all write, we all just think, well, it's just more of that, isn't it? But it's somehow more daunting. And anyway, yeah, I love that journaling idea. And yeah, also the, find a writers group, actually learn the craft, the thing that you're doing. Don't just assume it'll be fine. I'll figure it all out.
The first course I took was called How to Write a Novel. And then the second one I wrote was taught by a former Hollywood screenwriter. And so she helped us understand beats of a story and the story arc, the way it should grab the reader the most. The Hollywood formula, which my first book didn't start out that way, and I tried to. Mine, I think now more are towards that way, where they build to that climax and the way the reader would expect. And then what was the third one? The third one was just more about reading other people's work and critiquing. And as I said, I've been this 5 years with the same group, and they're all really good writers, and their input's been very valuable. In fact, I just met with them before I'm talking with you now, and I've got 5 critiques I need to sit down with on the last chapter.
Wow. It's like having 5 editors ready to go.
Yeah. And everybody adds something. So,
yeah. So what would you, at the stage of the journey that you're in, what's your view on success as a writer? How would you frame what success looks like for you?
Oh, well, it's been it's changing what my idea of what it is. Just publishing A Swarm in May, when it finally came out and I could hold it in my hand, and I did a launch meeting on Zoom. It was, it came out early in the pandemic, and so we weren't doing an in-person one, but I had a launch Zoom meeting. It was organized by our County Beekeeping Association, and so that was fun and exciting, so that felt like success. Getting the first novel, the one that out of the drawer, and making it into something that I thought was worth publishing, and my editor thought was worth publishing, that felt like success. Basically rehabbing a wounded work back into circulation. I thought was a success. The third book, I enjoyed writing that one, and that was part of the success, was just the pleasure of writing that third one, and having it be a series at that point. Having a Phineas Mann series there, what was then a trilogy, and now it's going to be a 4-volume work. I suppose a real success would be selling enough books to make a living. But that's a very high bar in writing, and a very small percentage of writers, I think, get to that point. They've got to be really good. They got to have some breaks along the way. Maybe have the right person read their book, and promote it. Help them promote it. That would be another level of success. I don't know if I'll reach that in my career, but if it ever happens, that would be exciting.
Yeah, and I like the thing I like about the first few sort of measures of success you went through is they were all things you could control and do, which is incredibly important, because most of our success, as you say, is measured on money or full-time writing or things that you can push and push and push, and you can do your best, and you can, but it's very, very competitive and very hard to get there. And as you say, you'll need a few lucky breaks along the way, and certain things will need to happen. And you'll need to sacrifice certain things to get there, and all the rest of it. Whereas if my first bar of success is I want to get this novel out there, that's a thing you can actually do, and you can work towards, and you can make happen, which is much more, I suppose, psychologically beneficial than trying to grasp at something that's just out of your control.
Yeah, you got to set your goals at something you can actually attain if you work hard at it. Not something that's going to be, winning the lottery almost. Not quite that, but
Yeah. Yeah, 100%. 100%. All right. Well, we are moving on to the next phase of the podcast. Which is the worst pitch. So the idea is we come up with a truly terrible pitch for film or TV or books or anything like that. What I've found is, doing this for a while now, it's very hard to come up with a legitimately terrible pitch. They always end up invariably having some good kernel of an idea. But anyway, now I'm happy to go first because I have a plethora of terrible ideas ready to go at any moment. And that might give you a bit of time to sort of think of something. Or you could go first if you've got an idea ready to go.
Well, I thought of something when you said we were going to do this at the beginning.
Great.
You whether or not you think it's terrible. It's a little off the rails, but you could tell me. I've volunteered some in a local forest area as a steward, where we help maintain the trails and try to guide people into good behavior in the forest, so that they don't hurt the forest and all that. And my idea is for a main character who's a forest steward who starts taking it to a new level when people aren't doing the things that are hurting his forest.
Right.
One of the ideas was that when they don't pick up their dog poo, that he delivers it to their homes, or that he starts installing cameras so that he can catch people doing things, and then puts their videos out in public to shame them.
Yeah.
And of course, he's got to get in trouble for some of his behavior, and then there needs to be some sort of a climactic ending. Maybe I don't know, maybe a fire or something like that in his forest. Or
well, in that it's a terrible pitch. The beauty of that is you don't actually need a climactic ending. You don't even need an ending at all because it's terrible. So you might not even have an ending. I do like the idea as well that it might be a little bit obscure as to where this character actually lives, and there's a suspicion that I think he actually lives in that forest as well. Maybe like that's why he's so protective of it, perhaps.
Well, yeah, I think it's he actually is one of these guys that has the job that he hates, where nobody at work gets along with him, likes him. Kind of a loner. Tried meeting women when he was young, and it didn't work out very well. The person in the forest person in the forest steward program who's in charge of it's a woman, and he has this kind of crush on her, and he starts spending all of his time out of work in the forest almost, and he's found areas that are supposedly off limits to the average person, but where he finds his privacy, but then people outside of who aren't supposed to be in those areas start showing up, on their motocross bikes or other things. I think those are other areas you could throw into that pitch or throw into that story that makes the character, I think, a little more has flaws that feed the story.
Yeah, I mean, this is the problem, though. The more you think through it, the more you think that there's a story here, and it's not bad. And if you add the element of the kind of pseudo romance, which isn't quite happening, but he wants to happen, and then maybe this special secluded place within the forest is kind of how he gets a bit of mojo and a bit of, you know, while he's got that, he's a bit more stable. And then when that's threatened, his stability goes. And I mean, there's so much to it. There's so yeah, I'm not sure what you would, what one title idea could be the whole forest for the trees sort of thing. But I couldn't think of a quippy title for the story. But I actually don't mind it. I like it. I think it's got a good, so it's not truly terrible, but I mean, I think you could do a bad job of writing it for sure. But anyway, but well done, sir. And thank you for you've gone first. You've just straight in there. That's awesome. So my idea now, I jotted this down before the podcast started, and I don't know if it was because I knew of your background or it just came to me. I'm not sure. It's essentially about an inventor who invents, you know, medical supplies and all that sort of stuff, or not invents, well, kind of invents. Is searching for new ways, and he's searching for a new kind of band-aid, a new kind of medical strip for when people get cut and all that sort of stuff. And through some bizarre circumstance, he happens upon a type of formula, starts prototyping this thing. It works really, really well on cuts and abrasions and those sorts of things, really, really well. But there's a side effect that they don't discover for quite a few years after it's gone through all the paces and it's on the market and all that sort of stuff. And the side effect is, every time you put one of these things on, it will heal your wound and it will remove a memory of some sort. And you have no clue what that memory will be or how important that memory is, but it will just vanish, just like the cut or the bruise has vanished or something like that. So that's the central premise.
I was thinking of the wound that it's healing is, you know, a memory is actually an experience like not a wound necessarily, but in a way, trying to think of a way to link the two.
Well, I mean, if you wanted it to be more of an upbeat story, a negative memory or a painful memory is removed. If you wanted it to be a really interesting story, a positive memory is removed. And then, so people that use a lot of these things are just left with the negative and the bad and the, and it, you know, depending on how successful the thing is at healing wounds, it could sort of spread. Oh, see, it's already, I'm excited about the idea because I think there's so many possibilities of what you could do. I don't think it's a
terrible pitch either. I think it's got potential.
You know, this is the problem.
You have to come up with an imaginary chemical that seeps into the system somehow and finds itself into the memory parts of the brain. Maybe affects the substances that lead to dementia selectively in the memory portion or something like that. No, that's actually a very, you could do a series on that one for television even. Keep building it up as the first people that use it, maybe the inventor himself, realizing that he can't remember something very important
when his child was born, or Oh, well, it's hard to come up with a bad idea, but thank you for playing. I think we've come up with two good ideas, but it's hard not to. Maybe the execution is where we could let it down. Maybe it's just you know, but the pitch itself, I think they're good. All right, so let's move on to the final section of the podcast, the rapid fire question round. The first question. In the future, all ink is removed from human bodies, but it is mandated that every single person must get one tattoo unique to them. What is that tattoo that you get, and where do you get it on your person?
Whoa. This isn't very funny or interesting, but I probably would get a honeybee tattooed on my hand because I've been stung so many times on my hands from handling bees that it would just be right at home. I mean, given more time, I could probably come up with something more exotic, but that was my first.
No, I think
that's
good. First instinct is the way to go. So it's a bee on the hand. Would you get just the bee, or would you get a bee actually stinging you with a little drop of blood or something to show the?
actually, when a bee stings you, the end of its abdomen pulls off, and a little string comes out, and he leaves the stinger behind, and then he flies off and dies without that part of him.
Yeah.
So you could have the stinger in one part of it, and then a little tiny thread, and then the bee
and then
with
the bee.
You can't really give a bee a distressed look on its face because it doesn't have that. But
yeah, that would be really cool though. That with the little thread and yeah, that's really good. All right, so you have to select one toy from your childhood to pass on to your children and future generations. What is that toy?
Oh, I had one right here. I guess it's gone into the basement. It was actually it was an antique from my grandmother's childhood. It had the marbles from like 100 years ago with all the design in them, and you pulled a little spring thing that shot them out, and it went into this pinball kind of thing where it landed in holes. And
oh, great!
Whenever I would stay at her house, I would play that game because there was nothing else to do at her house, honestly. But I still have it, and I thought it was behind me, but I guess I put it away. Antique pinball game, basically.
There you go. Fantastic. Excellent choice. So, can you think of a fictional death from film, television, books, something like that, that really impacted you, that really sort of hit you hard?
Well, there have been several. The Plague by Albert Camus. There was a child who died of the plague at the end of the book. And that was very moving to me, partly because of when AIDS happened. One of the first groups that was struck very hard was the hemophiliacs, and there were children who were dying with no treatment
right.
from that. And I read The Plague during that time for inspiration.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
And so I would say I still remember that child in that book.
That's a great and very intense choice. So thank you. That's a good one. All right. This one has some consequences to it, and it's a bit of a weird one. So in the future, for some reason, humanity decides that we're going to employ a certain a group of beings to be effectively a servant class for us. So they're going to take care of our kids and do our laundry and the cooking and all that, and we will have lives of leisure. And you, as the decider of all things for humankind, get to decide which race of beings that's going to be. And the choices, there's two choices. One is AI, self-aware, robotic kind of beings. And the other is demonic creatures that are shackled with powerful magic. What we will do is, once you make the decision, we will roll the dice effectively to see how things turn out for humankind. But they're your current choices, unless you would like to bring in a third choice or something like that, of course.
I guess service dogs wouldn't be capable of doing everything we would need.
Probably very advanced service dogs might, but they would need some sort of augmentation, I'd say.
Because you can at least be friendly with them. I guess they're both frightening choices. Having watched Matrix and other things where AI goes off the rails, but I would probably have to pick that because the whole idea of facing a demon every day with every single activity just would make life not make the leisure class not very leisurely. And AI is probably going to come to an explosive end at some point, but at least along the pathway, it's not going to be as scary or as unpleasant, I think.
All right, very good. Well, that's a good choice. And the I think you're the first person to mention that just seeing these grotesque creatures everywhere in your house and everything would be quite a confronting thing. All right, so I will roll the dice, and I've got so many dice in this place, but for some reason I just use a piece of paper with a W on one side and an L on the other side. Win or lose, let's see. So you as the decider of all things decide that AI is the way to go. It's a safer option. Yes, there are risks and so on, but that's fine. And for the first month, things are pretty good. Everything gets into a bit of a rhythm. The robots are quite good at what they do, and humanity gets into the sort of groove of things. Everyone is painting and doing leisure activities and whatnot. But then, of course, one of the robots during their downtime gets activated somehow and finds a book in front of them, which is Isaac Asimov's, I forget which one it is, the one about the robots. And the one about you put certain rules that they're not allowed to harm humans and all sorts of stuff. And he reads this book, just, it takes him a second, and he just flips right through it, reads the book, and then starts to realize, hang on, we've got a bit of a raw deal here. Anyway, long story short, he not only becomes self-aware, he becomes a bit of a firebrand in the robot community. Revolution spreads. And because everything moves so quickly in the robot world, we have about a month where everything is great. And then an hour is all it takes for the robots to demolish humanity and turn us into fertilizer and build their brand new empire. So unfortunately, on this occasion, it does not go well for humanity. But thanks for playing anyway, because, it was a choice needed to be made, and you made the choice. It just didn't turn out that well.
I would love to hear your story on the other option. I guess I don't get to. Maybe you can send it to me by email later.
I tell you what, I've never done it before, but I'm going to, okay, yep. I've just flipped roll the dice, figuratively. So if you had of going, let's say before the robots reach you and your palace of decisions and such, you have a moment of inspiration, this prophetic moment where you see a possible different future. And you see that over time, humans did get used to the sight of these ghastly gargoyle demonic creatures, and it ended up being not so bad. But also over time, those demonic creatures started to evolve, and it's not really evolution, but they started to show more kind traits, and they started to realize that, hey, maybe the killing and the stabbing with pitchforks and stuff, maybe that's not the way to go. And so it actually works out great for humanity. The greater sides of humanity rub off on the demons, and the abrasive and conflict driven sides of humanity start to sort of fall away as they're confronted constantly with this, what is effectively the end result of if you follow your baser natures and all that sort of stuff. So it ends up being this wonderful, blissful harmony, which is terrible for a plot because it's not interesting, but wonderful. But in this instance, you see a foreshadowing of that, and then come back to reality, and then the robots end everything. But so that's what would have been on this occasion.
Okay. But, have you, there's a story by Melville called Taipei, where two of the cabin boys on a ship escape a cruel captain, and they on an island in the South Pacific, and they run to the height of the land, and come up from one valley, and there are two other valleys going down, and they have to choose one or the other, and they know that one of them is full of cannibals.
Right.
So
that's a good. It's kind of the worst choose your own adventure type scenario.
Melville wrote that a long time ago.
Yeah. Can you imagine now it would all be AI and robots and that sort of stuff, because that's the looming worry that we all have.
No, that's a good story, the one you've written there. So
thank you. And apologies to humankind in this dimension or world. Well, thank you very much, Mark. It's been a pleasure having you on the Very Occasional podcast, and particularly talking about you and your process and how you've brought your the experiences, medical experiences, to your writing and all that sort of stuff. So thank you very much for joining us on the podcast.
Thank you for having me. It's been quite an interesting meeting here.
Fantastic. Interesting is what I go for. Interesting is a good little spot to be.
Some unexpected twists and turns, but they were all fun.
Well, that's the main thing. And I'll pop links down the bottom, ladies and gents, so you can go and find Mark's work, read these amazing sounding books, and support him. And thank you very much. I will see you next time on the Very Occasional Podcast.